Hello and welcome to Elden Kings, an Elden Ring discussion. I am your host, Gideon the Half-Knowing, and joining me for a special night of discussion on alchemical symbolism in Elden Ring is Quirkus from Reddit. Hey Quirkus, how are you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's so fun to have you finally on the podcast. We've been talking about this for, over a year now. I mean, isn't that crazy?
Oh yeah, it's very wild, and I'm very excited to be here and just kind of spew about all this stuff,
I mean, that's what a podcast is for, just throwing caution to the winds and saying anything that comes to your mind.
right? And it's so much better than just typing out these insanely long posts with all these, reference points. It's just easier to just spit it out. So
Yeah, I think it's more compelling to listen to and to absorb as well. Like there's some point where you can only read through so many blocky texts of evidence and whatnot, and there's I don't know, there's an emotional resonance that comes from talking to someone about it. There's even cultures, not to get too far ahead of ourselves in the magic, that believe that the only way to transmit a spiritualist idea is through the verbal connection, and they sort of preserve an oral tradition through that belief, which is
oh yeah,
interesting to me.
absolutely. And I think even just with like the themes in Elden Ring, like of like dualities and two opposites coming together, right? Having discussions and multiple perspectives like this really like speaks to the very ideas in the game. So I don't know, it's just really cool. It's such an expansive tapestry that it's really hard to just like type out stuff that doesn't just end up being these insane rambles. So
Absolutely. And I know that this is getting ahead of the note sheet we have, but
oh
like
oh
we
please
said,
please do. We're gonna go all over the place. I cannot stay on track, so don't even worry about it.
oh, 100%. I'm so here for the stream of consciousness. So let's get into Elden Ring as a consciousness elevation sort of type of media. It tries to define its own internal narrative through these ideas of pursuing like a higher place of being, like that sort of hermetic idea of achieving God through the self. And I feel like this I've talked with a lore YouTuber, Saint Trina, before about how Elden Ring has this own way of teaching the player how to achieve that journey for themselves. Like even the idea of attaining the Elden Ring, attaining the Holy Grail, attaining personal completion. How do you feel about these ideas? I'm curious.
Oh, I think that's kind of the whole point of the game. The when I look at Elden Ring, the thing that I can compare it to the most is a book that I have not read called Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, right? And this book is like legendary just for being very very inaccessible, but when you get into it, it just unfolds for you. You just start seeing how it's so connected to like, the human experience and history and like, like evolution of consciousness, and like making all these like references and connections and illusions that like, take you to this place and take you to that place, all while you're being kind of like guided on this idea of like Finnegan's Wake, right? Like flowing down this river. Like there's this river theme in the book, and it's just all about the flow, right? And part of that flow is reaching that moment of enlightenment, right? When you finally understand, right, that special moment, but you can't hold on to that moment, right? Like that's the thing I keep coming back to with Elden Ring is, you have these moments where you figure it out, right? Something just starts clicking for you, and it all just comes together, and you're having this great feeling. But then like, the next day you're like, I don't know, like, America's Radigan. What does that mean? Like you get lost in the sauce again. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it's just this really special game that's just this amazing piece of art that just like it like you said. I love Saint Trina, by the way. Just great stuff. Um, and yeah, it is about enlightenment and like higher consciousness and just connecting with all these different parts of humanity that make us feel whole, like more connected to each other. And so I don't know.
I really like that. instance of describing enlightenment. Or like, you have these revelations, and at the peak of these revelations you're like, I'm on top of the world, I figured it out. But then you remember that the first step of wisdom is acknowledging that you really don't know anything. So
Right?
in achieving this momentary glimpse, this momentary enlightenment, you then realize that there's just so that much more to learn, even. And it's just a continual path of learning, about that there's more to learn.
Yeah, and so for me, George R. Martin is just like a huge component of Elden Ring, and he has this piece of writing he did on fantasy. Like I think it's just for a book or whatever, but he talks about in there how like fantasy is this like that moment right before you wake up. When you're having that dream where everything tastes sweeter, everything is so much more special, and then you wake up and you're back in kind of like the harsh reality of it all. The saturated colorless world that we kind of live in, right? But it's in these moments where we feel like we have this greater understanding through art mostly, right? Through storytelling these days. It's I don't know, it's just really special to me, like how this game like draws these ideas out of people, and like you can see it all over the community, how this game has drawn so many different perspectives out of people, like so much I don't know, art and like challenge runs and videos. I don't know, it's just incredible, and these games have always done that, which is it's just so special. So
Yeah, it's beautiful to see how such a cult following of the series has evolved around it. And now that it's gone into the mainstream, it's sort of held on to that unique identity with the community where people are really avidly into the lore. Even like, I mean, of course there's always going to be those editions of the community that are more gameplay, more visual, more other
right.
things focused, but Soulsborne and Elden, even now that we have Elden Ring, it all feels like there's so much focus on the narrative still, and I love that.
I mean, for me, in a lot of ways, the narrative is what keeps these games alive. I still go back and look at Demon Souls theories and, Dark Souls theories and the Blood. I still read all this stuff because, like, and it's interesting, like, with the whole Golden Order, right? Right? Like, there's not really, like, a set narrative for these games, Like, yeah, I mean, we got, the community agreed upon consensus for all these different stories, right? But, like, there's so much ambiguity and room for interpretation that like the games just never die. You can just keep pouring over this stuff forever, and I mean, for me, it's just endlessly fun because, like, as I've learned more about Elden Ring and, like, alchemy and other esoteric ideas and, like, fantasy literature, and, and I look back at, like, Dark Souls and Bloodborne, like, just new pathways of inquiry and, curiosities open up for me, every time I play those games. It's incredible. I've never seen anything like it. Like I said, that's why I compared it to Finnegan's Wake, because there's not too many things I can think of where people like years and years and years later are still just pouring over this stuff as if it just came out.
Yeah, no, it's a really unique way of the games having a staying power in people's minds. I think one of my favorite Dark Souls 1 videos is actually it's from the recent wave of Elden Ring players who were fresh to the series with Elden Ring, going back and adding their own like new contextualized views to older games. And it's this Tarnished Archaeologist video, and honestly, I don't think it really covers new ground per se in the macro narrative, because all it really establishes is deeper intricacies about the Way of White in Dark Souls 1. I'm not sure how familiar you are with.
Oh, I saw the video. I love
Yeah,
Dungeons
perfect. It's
Archaeologist.
such a good video because
Absolutely.
it goes so deep into the statues and the meaning of the baby versus the child, and like the inverse of just the meaning. I don't want to dwell too deep on it. I'll probably link the video in the description below if anyone's interested.
No, it's all good, and I think that's like a perfect example of kind of like what individual perspectives like can really lend to a piece of art like that, because I we played these games for years. I had never thought of those statues in that way before. And I mean, I'd recently gone back and, had been dinking around in Dark Souls with, some of my newer and added knowledges. And I was thinking about things like, that lady sitting in like a tree throne, right? And she has like this child, right? And so it's almost like a mother goddess, right? Like an earth mother goddess, idea, right? And then in the game, Solaire talks about, Gwen as this, father son figure, right? And Dark Souls 2 mentions how Dark is the mother of us all, right? So we're always looking for Gwen's wife, and like obviously it's got to be this lady on the throne. Like there's got to be some sort of connection between these figures, right? And to me, it's like it's again showing us these archetypal ideas of like sun and earth, sun and moon, man and woman, dualities coming together, which again is just a theme that you see over and over in these games, which is so fun to dig into, because Elden Ring acts as like a culmination of all these ideas.
Yeah. And like this isn't like From Software has been using a lot of this symbolism, a lot of like these alchemical archetypes and different like cultural, real world cultural illusions for longer than the Soulsborne games have even existed. Like, I have heard a lot about Armored Core games using, the Sun and Lion. I think that was sort of, I think I've talked about that in your circles actually.
Yeah.
I've seen it talked about. And then I've also heard about how, like, Kingsfield has certain, like, Jewish Hebrew influences in the Kabbalah and its naming schemes, although I can't speak to the specifics of that. So it's fascinating to me that From Software has just been using these illusions for so long and has still been finding ways to iterate and evolve and use them in their own unique ways. It's very cool.
Yeah, I totally agree, and it's just it's very interesting how they reuse this symbolism, or well, I guess more of the concepts behind the symbolism, but they repackage it in different ways with each game. Because like you look at something like, I don't know, the First Flame and the Elden Ring, and there is a lot of conceptual overlaps between this like light that like shines on the world and gives everybody their runes, and which is the souls in this game, and the First Flame, which illuminates the world and gives everybody their soul in that game. I mean, like there's so much overlap, and I mean, they're both with the trees, right? The Arch Tree and the Erd Tree, like they have very specific things that they are wanting to tell us through these games over and over. And like to me it's a lot about like cycles, and just like we were talking about with the oh man, I lost my train of thought, I'm sorry.
No, I mean that's the stream of consciousness for you. I get it. Uh well, here, as a way to jump back into it, something we mentioned in DMs was about the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet and how those sort of like correlate to the tarot, how that correlates further to Kabbalah. Is there any springboard into Kabbalah specifically that you'd like to take based off of these ideas? Since I know it's something that both of us have, a lot of ideas about.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the Tree of Life is probably just a good place in general to start with this, because we see this motif repeated, over and over in these games, with Dark Souls, with Elden Ring, with Sekiro and their divine dragon, with the Sakura tree.
The Everblossom.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So like they use this idea over and over, and to me, well, and not just to me, like symbolically speaking, the Tree of Life, represents this kind of like this center of the universe idea, right? And like that's it works really well with the First Flame, kind of manifesting in the hollow of this tree, right? Because this is gonna end up being the tree that we kind of play the game on. Not specifically. There's a bunch of trees there that are kind of making up the world, but this is kind of the bridge, this great hollow that we use to ascend, down into Ash Lake, which is where we find this, big black, void sea where these trees are all growing out of, right? So this big black void sea, is kind of like, the infinite nothing at the beginning of the universe, right? And this tree that grows from it, represents the universe. Is essentially the idea that you see kind of over and over in these different creation myths. Like with Yggdrasil, and Gnungagap. The void at the beginning of creation there, and you have like again these dual elements. You have the fires of Muspelheim mixing with the ice of Niflheim, right, which thaws to create Ymir, which is this androgynous being who again kind of represents this, formless nothingness of the universe, but now it's personified as a person.
Yeah, and there's like potential and existence of people as concepts, like you can.
Well, and like people as trees, right? Like we're like this idea, our runes when they drop in Elden Ring
They become a
are,
tree or like a
yeah, they be
little. Yeah.
like a little sprout, right? And so this idea as like a person as a tree, like consciousness as a tree, like existence as a tree. This is kind of like a core theme with all of these games, and that's why we have these little bonfires, right, or these little sites of graces. These are representing kind of like mini trees, like mini worlds of consciousness, like in Demon Souls with the archstones, right? The monumental talks about how reality has faded into the fog, right? When people lose their souls, which is clarity, right? The understanding of the world. They lose their souls, and like that clarity drifts into the fog. And these archstones act as like the linking points that keep the world, that part of the world intact, right? So when we find these sites of graces or these bonfires and we light them, it's kind of like we're re-illuminating these little points of the world. And when we go back to the bonfires and the sites of grace, and we rest, it kind of resets the world. So
Yeah.
it's this tree of life is this like central point that acts as the transformative point, the cycle point where like I mean where time kind of manifests and flows from and back into, right? Like in Dark Souls, the first flame is connected to time. One of the I think it's the repair item descriptions mentions that light is time, and I believe it's the twisted wall of light talks about how reality is can be manipulated by light. So this is
Yeah.
like, oh, sorry, go ahead. I'm just rambling here, bud.
I love the ramble. No, this is so perfect, and there's so many ideas to springboard off of. Like you really see that idea of souls as time in the Souls trilogy, specifically in Dark Souls 3, where you see the drag pile at the very end of the game against when you fight the Soul of Cinder. You see that the world has literally collapsed in on itself in terms of space time. Like it's all conjoined into one place, which is very it's a perfect example. But
Yeah.
like, oh, go on, go on.
Oh well, so speaking of those like archetypal ideas of like sun and moon and man and woman or light and dark, right? Space and time, right? We can match up that ash lake, that big void, to the idea of space, right? Because before the first flame, it's just a formless landmass or whatever it is with the dragons. I mean, it can't be described basically because it's supposed to be formless and timeless. It represents this original, you know, unconscious form of nature before anything is there to distinguish it, to make disparity, to make differences, to perceive differences, really, right? And that comes with consciousness and time, So all of these things are linked to the tree of life and the manifestation of, honestly, human consciousness, right? Like we're not talking about, they're not making a game about, animal consciousness here. They're talking about people becoming conscious,
Yeah,
from
even if
from
there's
nature.
different types of lords, even if there's like the undead, the witches, the gods, the humans, they're all operating on human consciousness. And if
I
you
mean, they're all
extrapolate that
using
to
the
like,
first flame, right? I mean,
yeah,
in my opinion, that opening sequence is talking about how the first flame manifests, right? And all that's there is the formless world, right? But once this flame manifests, you have the duality, and then this duality, it's what this fire is what draws things out of the dark, right? They come from the dark. Everything in that game comes from the dark because it comes from this duality, and it's about the combination of duality is what creates. It's the fire in the tree that then creates life. The dragons are stone until they get the fire, and then they become alive. Before then they're nothing. They're unconscious. They're stone.
yeah. And even Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, the first, one of the first people to even have a Lord Soul, he is hollow by the time we fight him in the game because his soul has burned away. Like he's not dead, he's not undead. He's hollow, which
Yeah,
is I think a very critical way of reading the game.
yeah, that hollow idea is this vessel idea, and when we think about the arch tree, these stone trees, and we think about the flame manifesting inside this hollow tree, this is the soul manifesting in the body, right? And then, like I said, this is what gives things life. So when we think about the hollows in the game and how they go to the fire, right, and they give up a piece of the dark soul, because Gwen's, linked this whole system together, right? But when you give up a piece of the dark soul, like you become human, right? You become conscious, alive. You have an identity. You're not just a vessel anymore. You're a person. And it's the classic mind body idea, but it's the mind and the body together, that makes a person. It's the space and time together that makes the reality. It's life and death together that makes the cycle. And these games are about, sealing away that that negative aspect of the cycle.
Mm-hmm. I think there's some further intricacies at play about like what is negativity and like what the state of a hollow is versus what the state of a pygmy with a dark soul is and what a light soul is, because partly like the twist of Dark Souls 1 is just that light bad, dark good, question mark, but it
Right?
always gets more complicated than that, of course. But I totally get what you're meaning. I think not to springboard us ahead back into Elden Ring, but at a macro level of talking about like the tree and life and like life being given to the world, I think you can sort of take a Gnostic Kabbalah-esque approach to interpreting the greater will and its control of the lands between. This isn't I don't want to talk about any strictly backstory things, but I also want to talk about like the interplay of themes where you have the Elden Ring, which exists within the Erd Tree and is in part synonymous with the Erd Tree. Like the Erd Tree wasn't the Erd Tree before the Elden Ring was forged. In that it used to be the Crucible. It was given definition, and in this way, you see like the relation of the Elden Ring to the 10 Sephiroth of the Kabbalah is this idea of the Elden Ring as the emanation of God's thoughts or the greater will's thoughts. And you see how like the great runes can represent different Sephiroth on the Kabbalah, and how then the entire Kabbalah is represented through the Erd Tree. But if we take this back to the micro level of how we were describing how runes from like an individual on death can sprout into its own, tree, you see like the macro level of the world with the soul of God, and then you see that encapsulated in the micro of the person with their own sort of runic identity, their true name, their runes, their prophecy, fate, whatever you want to describe it as. And I guess just to sum it all up, there's like a big thing in Hermeticism where you have this idea of the universe encapsulated in the one. Anyone that's watched Full Metal Alchemist knows the all is one, one is all, famous line. I'm not sure if you've seen FMA.
Oh, I have indeed.
Oh, hell yeah. So yeah, what are your thoughts on this? I'm curious.
So, the other fun line from Full Metal Alchemist is, what could be equivalent to a human soul, right? And there's this idea of a sacrifice, kind of, what, like when Ymir, right? When we look back at like Ymir, right? Like he is killed to make the world, right? And we look at this crucible idea and this life sprouting from death, over and over, and this crucible could be thought of as like the unconscious, right? And the unconscious has different archetypes in it, and these archetypes could be thought of like the Sephiroth. It's not like a one-to-one, but like this idea of emanations, right? Like we all have a like kind of our center, right? This self, this aspect, who that we think at least, sits at the center of our minds, kind of. And it echoes out, it ripples out into the world.
I assume you're getting into like Jung a little bit, like Carl Jung with the archetypal stuff and the inner perception of self.
Yeah, yes, and it's so it's this game is just so complex, right? There's so many levels to it that it's just hard to focus in on one because we the Albinorics are created through this ripple idea, right? Like a droplet and a ripple,
Hmm.
right? And like this is a great example of this like emanation idea that we're talking about because at the top of the Kabbalah, I'm sorry, not the Kabbalah, the Tree of Life, you have the first Sephiroth, Kether, right, the crown. This represents the one, and we would connect this idea to something like the one great, the manifestation of God, Ymir, again, to just go back to Norse mythology, because I really do think a lot of the game is using mythic archetypes, and I think that's the way they want us to think about this stuff in the game. So Ymir is like this androgynous being, right? He represents this one concept, the one great, and he ends up getting split, and when we look at the Tree of Life, with Kether, it splits into two separate spheres. It splits into Chakma, which is the masculine side, and Bina, which is the feminine side. And then these spheres recombine to then emanate down into the other Sephiroth, right? So when we look at Radigan America as like, a symbol for this androgynous being, we see this idea with, the demigod children. Now I know they're not all Radigan and America's children, or maybe they are if they were always the same person, right? That's a whole complex different topic. But when we think about these emanations, coming from this center, we can think about them in like an archetypal way, because like the one is kind of the central archetype, like because everything goes back into this one. Like it's one of those really complex ideas that's actually really simple when you think about it, because like all is one and one is all, like you said, so it all like leads back to this. And the way that this story is structured, in my opinion, is about these archetypal ideas, so we can look at these other demigods as kind of echoing the stories of Radigan America as like our central archetypal figures. And I'd also throw in Renala in there as like a really important archetypal figure, because she's representing, all the moon stuff, all the triple goddess stuff, which is again, a major archetype for like the feminine.
Yeah. Well, I guess that gives us two sort of major points to talk about, depending on which direction we want to go. But talking about America and Radigan is like sort of like the alchemical rebus, this idea of perfection between balancing two wholes. You see that across many mythologies. For instance, I think in the Greek creation myth for humans, it sees Zeus split apart man and woman because they were once whole, and that's why you have this idea of like them seeking out each other to create like monogamous couplings as you seek out your other half. On the offset, we also see that sort of triple goddess thing again iterated in Greek mythology with like Hecate, the goddess of the crossroads and magic and fate and sort of like arcane whatever things. And she was represented through having like sort of three aspects of herself, and you get the maiden, the mother, and the crone archetype, which is played out among a lot of popular media as well as I feel like ancient mythology, to the point where like what comes from what becomes a bit distorted in our modern era. I'm okay going whichever route you want, or you can combine them or something
Yeah,
entirely
so
new.
the triple goddess, is really interesting because it's ultimately it demonstrates the idea of like the three who are one, right? When we talk about these archetypal ideas, I want to talk about George R. R. Martin stuff for a second, because I think he has an example that we could kind of use to help guide us through this in Elden Ring, right? So he has the Faith of the Seven, right? They are the seven gods of Westeros who are actually aspects of just one god, right? And the one side of this, the feminine side, is our classic triple goddess, maiden, mother, crone. But he created a masculine side of this as well, which is father, warrior, and smith. And then both of these archetypes combine into the stranger, which represents death, which represents the one great. And like this is like why I keep coming back to this one great idea, because at the end of the day, George R. R. Martin doesn't really believe in gods, right? He, like, in A Song of Ice and Fire, there aren't gods per se. And I mean, I know in Elden Ring, these are gods, and Gwen is a god, right? And they're all the gods. But what we're ultimately talking about with all this stuff is like humanity, right? Like George R. R. Martin isn't writing a story just about gods, and FromSoft isn't making games just about demons and monsters. This is about people. This is about the duality within people. So this one archetype, this death, right, represents this realm of transformation, right? It's the original point from which everything returns to and is reborn from. And that, and so we get back to the tree idea that grows from this original point and is the center point, and this
and the
tree.
Axis Mundi, like, the tree
Yeah.
is an Axis Mundi. That's repeated through so many mythologies.
Yeah, and
this
so-
idea
and the
of a central part of the world.
Yeah, and the reason I keep getting so tripped up is because this axis is representing, the center, the one. So when we talk about, Renala and Marika and Radigan and Godfrey and all these people, these are all just a big messy overlap of ideas between all these characters. Godfrey's a warrior, right? But he's also like a father. I don't know if he's really a smith, but he does kind of forge the Elden Ring, right? Radigan's definitely a father, right? And he's definitely a smith of some kind. I mean, we see him, hammering away at the end of the game, and he's a champion, right? So these archetypal ideas are just everywhere in this game because it's about the archetypal ideas, in my opinion. And that's why we're seeing, so many, allusions to popular mythology because they want us to recognize, that it's about mythology in some ways. It's about the symbols. It's about these archetypes. The specifics matter for the direct narrative that we're being told. But to really get into what's going on in this game, we have to start going beyond, what we're literally, being told in the game and start looking at what we're being shown. When we walk into the Erd Tree at the end of the game and we see Radigan and Marika as one person with the Elden Beast, we're supposed to interpret this as going beyond the veil, back to the Tree of Life concept. We're going to the highest rung of the Tree of Life. We're meeting God. We're meeting this Kether, this one great. This being that has all the aspects united into it, and this being is represented by this Elden Ring. And the interesting thing about the Elden Ring and the runes and and this idea of the Hebrew letters, which the name of God that creates the universe, is this game lets us reforge it. So to me that's just incredibly interesting because we're dealing with some high level metaphysical ideas in this game. That's why it's just so hard to talk about in any really deep sense because we're just talking about abstractions upon abstractions and metaphors on metaphors here like that because this game is just so metaphorical in so many ways. I'm not even sure we're supposed to interpret the lands between as an actual real place. I mean, it's called the Lands Between. That's not the name of a continent, that's not the name of a country or whatever. This is a metaphysical location in a game about metaphysical ideas. So it's just so layered. Sorry, I'm again just rambling.
No, I love the rambling. I do the exact same thing, and I love it. There's a lot of ideas that come off of this, and I have definitely read a number of theories that support the idea of the Lands Between as a spirit world, and there's so many ways to read into that just as a name. Something that comes to mind when you describe the Elden Ring, our experience with the Elden Beast, is a quote from Selen that you get after completing her quest line, which, in my opinion, is designed to remind the player of exactly what you were describing, that when they enter the Erd Tree, they're having an experience that goes beyond what pretty much any human is ever going to experience. And basically what Selen says is, "Do you recall what I once told you? That glintstone is the amber of the cosmos, and sorcery is the study of the stars, and the life therein. When you become Elden Lord, please illuminate me. Lay bare the secrets of life which course the Elden Ring. Next time, I will be your student. And if you look at how the Elden Beast looks, if you look at how the Elden Beast draws you into this higher plane, the Astral Sea, as we've sort of talked about it in our DMs, and I'm sure which we'll elaborate more on later,
For sure.
you see, like, the player learns a lot about the Elden Beast. Just seeing the Elden Beast, the fact that it's depicted through a nebula, I can't remember the name of it, but like a very specific nebula inspiration on top of the Nightwalker inspiration from Mononoke, like this god of death, this god of the cosmos and life. You see a lot of ideas. Like Selen is asking you about what you learn from seeing the Elden Beast, what all of the implications there are, which I think is it's just vastly interesting. I have more about other things that you mentioned, but I'd like to give you a chance to springboard off of it. I'm curious about what your thoughts are.
Well, I mean, we're walking in there and meeting God essentially, and this God is this space dragon amoeba thing. It comes the thing I find most interesting is how it comes out of this black formless water. Which again is just this prima materia is the word in alchemy, since we're supposed to be talking about alchemical symbolism here, right? This prima materia is I think the best comparison for it in the game is the Crispus vials stuff, the weird black liquid that's in
the talisman that makes you silent.
Yeah, exactly. And so, like, this idea of silence, right? And, this black, formless water, and it's still, right? Like, I find Placidusax's name very interesting because it has, placid in it. So it implies, placid water. I grew up, in the 90s, right? So Lake Placid, is, always pops into my mind, which is this movie about an alligator in just a, giant lake that is just still, and Martin loves to do this. He loves this duality and he uses it all over his writing. So things like stillness, silence, speechlessness, like these are all supposed to kind of be symbols of, like, not the negative aspect, but the unconscious aspect, we'll say, the opposite of the duality. Because most people, life is about being animated and making noise and being active, right? And so the Elden Beast is this golden, ultimately a golden light, right? Like its head is this light, and its spinal cord or whatever is this golden tree, essentially, which is very interesting in, like, kind of Eastern, belief systems with the Kundalini serpent and the energy traveling up your spine, right? Because this is kind of like, the Elden Beast is kind of representing almost like a nervous system, right? Like it's the central nerves, of the tree. And it comes out of this black, formless water. And I feel this imagery is really evocative of the memory of lost grace, which I think is just one of those items that, if you think about it, explains so much about the game. Because you see this, this is the item that all Tarnished start with, and you see this, golden light rising out of what looks like, formless dark water. And there's just so much, like, symbolism layered here, right? Because this is like the light of consciousness emerging from the unconscious. This is like, the spark of creation coming from the void of nothingness. And it casts this, like, reflection on the water, which is, with all the mirror imagery that we get with, the moon stuff and Raya Lucaria, like this reflection idea, this, duality idea, again, like with Dark Souls, emerges from the coming of the light. It's what creates the dark and the light. Before there, and there's just, nothing. And so the Elden Beast emerges, and he represents this, divine light, and it represents the order of the world. He's the manifestation of the order of this world. So, again, like, just layers and layers of the symbol, like the tree, like the ring, like the Elden Beast, these are all symbols of this, central point of unity that ultimately represents reality. Since you got the DLC coming up and we have all this veil imagery, right? This light is, in a way, the veil of reality. Because, when you look at, like, Eastern philosophy and, like, alchemy, we're all one, right? All is one, one is all. And so the thing that ends up dividing us, that creates disparity, is, light. which goes back to like the twisted wall of light description from Dark Souls 3, where it talks about how light can manipulate reality. Like, I really think this idea is central to what is going on with the Elden Ring and the runes and, the flame from Dark Souls and all that. But really in Elden Ring, with like this light shining from this center point that is, that's writing reality in a sense, and then it goes back to the Hebrew letters, with the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah is structured with these pathways between the Sephiroths, which are representative of the Hebrew letters. So it's creating these bridge and connection points through, letters, language, right? Through the word, through writing. It's through language that we are able to make these types of connections, and through these connections, we, make the world that we perceive. And so we all carry our runes with us in the game, and we give these runes to Melina, and then she uses them to shape our character, right? So
And
when
if
we
you look at the dialogue with Melina, she even speaks to that by asking you what your ambitions and desires are, as if that has a play into how she shapes your runes to give you strength. That, like, this idea of your runes representing your ideals, I think, yeah, there's definitely an interplay there.
Yeah, it's your beliefs. I mean, it's representing who you are and who you want to be. It's how we all ultimately, make ourselves. Like, we all have this inner self, right? This one aspect of ourselves, that is represented by our runes, right? But those runes emanate out, and we are able to kind of like use our words, use our clothes, use our likes and our dislikes to shape who we are. And in Elden Ring, I find it really interesting because, somebody eventually gets to claim this ring that shapes all of reality. They get to write reality for everybody. But like, nobody wants just one person writing their reality, right? Of course not, So I don't know. It's
I
just
think that's what you get. There's such rich symbolism in that. Like, if you look at some of the pre-Elden Ring interviews, I think Miyazaki has said something along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, but he said something along the lines of, uh, the Great Runes represent different ideologies, and ideology is such an important word to me because that's not a belief, that's not a religion. It's a governing political idea of rulership. And in this way, I think that you can see these different Great Runes possessed by different shard bearers who rule different biomes as being these own sort of cultural manifestations of that land. And the Elden Ring, it's not only a symbol of like the emanation of God being emanated into the world, like we've been talking about at the macro metaphysical level, but it's also this symbolic representation of like the politics in the world, of how
mm.
these different, biomes, these different territories of the Golden Order rebel, go their own way, decide their own political structure. And you see these ambitions, these great runes are defined by their leaders, just like how the player's rune is defined by their own ambitions and ideologies and desires. The rule, like Radahn, Rykard, Morgott, their great runes define their territories, and the macro level with the Tarnished, when they become Lord, they get the Elden Ring, which is all the great runes and which defines all the territories. And I yeah, it's quite nice to me. Like, you even see it with the mending runes. Like, these are things that are created of people's beliefs, and
Yeah,
it's
they're
very
new
powerful.
ideologies that they're putting into the whole, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so that idea about everybody having their own area is ties really nicely into this Erd tree idea, and ultimately like the Weirwoods from A Song of Ice and Fire, where each castle, each region has its own Weirwood tree in their Godswood, right? And if we think of this tree, as this center point, right? Like I like the Dark Souls with the first flame. I think the bonfire works really good for this idea, right? Because when you light a bonfire, it casts out a ring of light around you, right? And this ring of light, you know, kind of represents, the safe, the comforting, like when you think of like prehistoric, humanity, huddled around the fire, and everything outside that fire is darkness, and that's where all the scary bad stuff is. Fire becomes this symbol of, civilization, of consciousness, of life, and so when you get the Elden Ring, you get to be the one who gets to decide what's inside this circle. So everybody has this, different ideas about what the outer gods are. And to me, what the outer gods are, aspects of reality that the person who holds the Elden Ring has deemed outside of their circle, outside of their order. Like, these are things that they don't want to exist. These are, the Elden Ring makes the laws of the world. These people are outlawed. They're exiled. They're on the fringes. That kind of idea. Just on the periphery.
I love this idea so much. I think that's partly why Elden Ring transcends the Souls trilogy so well, because the Souls trilogy was great. They had a lot of very deep ideas going on, but at the core of it, they were always limited by this core light versus dark dichotomy that had it had certain
unfortunate connotations.
Yes, exactly. It had a lot of stuff to unpack that they had holding them back. Exactly. And so when you have Elden Ring, which recontextualizes so much of the information that was first presented in Souls, especially like the symbolism, you get like you were saying, like these really cool ideas where rather than dark being an inherent property of the world that is simply separate than light, and that works in Dark Souls 1 because dark was good and not evil as the twist. But like in Elden Ring, they go further and they make it so that there is no inherent separation. Like Muriel says, heresy is but a contrivance. All can be conjoined. Like, heresy is a perception that is just unwilling to accommodate a new perception. So the Elden Ring used to be malleable in the early days of the Golden Order. It used to be like syncretic, we could say, where like religions
Yep.
and philosophies could merge with each other. But over time, what is outer order becomes more increasingly defined by the rulers of the Golden Order. I actually, the last podcast recording gets into that a little bit too, with like the Golden Order theocracy stuff. But yeah, it's just really cool. Do you have any ideas to springboard, or shall I continue?
Oh, I mean, I can literally talk about this stuff just ad infinitum, as we get deeper into it. Like that, the hard part is always starting out when you begin these ideas, because you have no baseline, and there's like a gazillion different ways you could approach all of these subjects, which is why I kind of like the George R. R. Martin baseline, because what you talked about, where Dark Souls 1 creates this like kind of evil aspect for the dark and this positive aspect for the light. Like, George R. R. Martin does that as well, but like his whole point is showing that these are all integrated, that we are all both masculine and feminine, right? That we all have both good and bad in us. And that doesn't mean, all bad people are just immediately forgiven and all good people are just saints, right? But like, to me, what George R. R. Martin's writing is about, and what like infuses Elden Ring, is humanity, right? It's giving people grace. Sometimes I get a little frustrated with the community, how they talk about characters like Marika or Ronnie, because like, we don't really understand the full context of like almost anything in this game, and when I look at a character like Marika, I see a lot of Cersei Lannister in her, but I see a lot of like Daenerys Targaryen in her. Like, who was Marika when she was a little girl? Did she want to be married to Godfrey or Hoarah, this barbarian warlord? At what point, does this Golden Order, get out of control for her, get out of her hands? When we look at a character like Daenerys or Cersei, both of their stories are about coming into power, and these the men around them, just to be blunt about it, right, are trying to take this power, trying to manipulate them to do what they think is best, trying to regulate them to the side. But like Marika and like Daenerys, is ultimately the one who has this divine power, right? Daenerys has these dragons. Marika has this Elden Ring. So they ultimately get to be the one to make this decision. But then we
And
have this whole... Oh, so go ahead.
it's not just like divine power and dragons too. Like they develop their own resources of cunning and intelligence that like
Oh yeah, but like
yeah.
but these dragons, like this Elden Ring, like this is the symbol of their like divine right of kings, right? Like when we look
Yeah.
at the Targaryens, right, and when we look at the royal family of Elden Ring, it's these runes and this ring, which like gives them their authority, and it's bestowed by God, quote unquote, which I think is just really important in terms of like history and what George R. R. Martin and Miyazaki are getting at with all these games, because they're all about monarchy, right? Like they all have these kings or like a church or like you know uh I don't know what Ishin is, but he's running Ashina, right? They all have these like leaderships and hierarchies that are fueled, ultimately by some sort of divine power, which is just a very interesting commentary on humanity when we think about what this divine power could start to represent in the real world.
Yeah. I mean, again, that's oh man, it's just interesting because I definitely like I'm fascinated by that topic of how you have this feudalism inspired game which showcases the divine right of kings in a setting where magic actually exists and
Right?
gods actually exist to endow people with the divine right of kings. Like you're the Elden Lord because you have the Elden Ring, and the Elden Ring actually exists. So you
Yep.
actually it goes back to that transcendence of ideology into actual impact on the metaphysical world. Like to look at the mending runes as an easy example, like they literally changed the nature of the Erdtree and thus the nature of the world. You have Goldmask's radiant mending rune where the Erdtree shines even brighter because it works better now. The Dung Eaters, as an inverse, changes the entire like shading of the tree. Even if it's brighter now, it's now cursed. But everything's cursed, so perhaps the curse is okay because outer order encompasses inner order, so inner order and outer order are the same. Balance exists.
They're equal, right? They're at an
Yeah,
equilibrium. But
yeah.
that's kind of the interesting thing. Like George R. R. Martin always has this idea of like what exists in the unconscious. Like we have the golden order, right? This daytime order, and he always does this type of thing where he sets up like one example of the duality and kind of like emphasizes it. And we see this in Elden Ring with the moon, right? The moon is all over the place. I mean, we have two of them for Christ's sakes, but the sun is barely mentioned at all. And he does this in his writing because he wants you to realize that there's something amiss here, there's something wrong, and we should be thinking about the sun and what's going on in that situation.
Okay, I'm curious where you're going with that, because of course there's the Erdtree and Elden Ring sun symbolism, but then there's also Farum. Well, I say Farum Azul, but like the city that was the seat of the sun, which could be other places too.
So my idea kind of with this whole game is that the one great is representing nature before humanity, really manifests, you know, ego consciousness, individual consciousness, that consciousness that views us as separate from nature, as like somehow different or apart or outside of this system. And then we, start acting upon this system, right? So I think, when we have Fair Missoula and we look at, the eternal cities and their moon and night imagery, I feel like there was a world that once existed that was just kind of a natural world where we had a mythological world where of course where we have giants and like kind of Nox elf people and that kind of stuff, but this is like the pre-human world, the mythic landscape, and humanity eventually evolves out of this, right? I really find the DLC trailer so interesting, and I can't wait to get into that game and see what's going on with this hand pulling something out of this womb imagery, because this hand, you know, the greater will is connected to a hand, which I just find so interesting, because like a human hand, right? That's humanity. That represents people. So the greater will to me represents human action on nature. And I had a hard time explaining this for a long time, but when we look at this trailer and we see this thing reach into what we assume is some sort of previous holder of the Elden Ring, and then they go out there and they're doing something, which has a roar and a storm kind of starting up in the background. I really start to think about the idea of, did humanity destroy this original order of nature and supplant it?
I mean, like, that's really what it looks like. I like
Right?
going back to like DS1 and how that evolves into Elden Ring. I I really love how you go from a world that didn't exist in like Dark Souls 1, like where like it's a literal creation myth of how the world comes to being from nothingness, from the noose as we were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Uh and that transfers to Elden Ring, where rather than it coming from nothing, rather than like the Elden Ring being a literal manifestation of everything, the greater will is less of a true god and more of like a demiurge figure. It's a
Yep.
shaper of reality, not a creator of reality. And in that way, you see how the prehistory can exist, as you say, as this fantastical land of giants and pre-human evolution, and that can be a thing. Like, it can be a world that exists with its own land masses, like living creatures, breathing creatures, thinking creatures, before the greater will comes and before it starts to shape things. And like, I mean, I think the Sinkiada item is such a perfect example. It talks about how beasts started to craft things with their 5 fingers, and you get this from Geraint the beast clergyman. And if his connection to Farum Azula is to be taken literally, then he's someone that has presided over like the beast clergy since the very beginning. So this is very old stuff that we're learning about, and it speaks to how human intelligence evolved from the beasts. And I'm so happy that you brought up the DLC, because like it's so true to Souls trilogy stuff. I don't like, if you play DS3 Ringed City, a lot of what you learn in the Ringed City is sort of technically what you already knew. Like, you already knew that Gwyn obscured the history of man, but what you learn in the DS3 Ringed City DLC is that Gwyn obscured the history of man by creating the Ringed City and giving it to the Pygmies so that the Pygmies would join him and allow themselves to be enslaved by him because they thought that the light was better than the dark. And like, attributing this to Elden Ring as an evolution of the Souls trilogy, you see the exact same thing. Like, we already knew that Marika engineered the destruction of the old order of the prehistory so that she could steal the Elden Ring and become the goddess of the new order and, become a monotheistic, Christian-inspired thing over the polytheistic prehistory. But what we see is what you just described, all of this rich symbolism, all of this rich backstory that elucidates so much more of what we can know about Elden Ring as a story. We learn that I'm so happy that you called it the previous god of the order, because that's how I read it too. Like, people have associated that pale flesh with like Godskin. Yeah, like they associate it with Godskin, but the Godskin are wearing the skin of gods. So like, if that's I mean,
there
I
had
agree.
to be a god.
Yeah, no. You've seen Princess Mononoke? I hope.
Oh, of course.
Okay, so you know how spoilers for Princess Mononoke.
It's honestly spoilers for everything. I'm sorry, I've been going off.
So true. This is very true. But like, you know how in Mononoke at the end, when the spirit god, it's shot and its head falls off and it becomes the Nightwalker as it dies.
Yep.
If you look at the Elden Beast with its Nightwalker inspiration, and the fact that it's the Elden Ring, if the previous god of the world, possibly the god that Placidusax awaits to return, if that used to be a tangible being that was the vessel of its own Elden Beast spirit, and then it was killed and taken by Marika, we could see this same situation. Like, this is the Mononoke god dying, being killed by Marika, and then created into the Elden Beast Elden Ring situation. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how much of that resonates with you.
No,
but
it absolutely resonates. I think this is why I get criticized for this sometimes, but this is why I like going outside of the game to look for examples, because I think this is what Martin and Miyazaki and FromSoft are just doing. Like literally, I just think this is what they're doing. I think they're taking these archetypal symbols and just re-putting them into the game. I mean, there's call-outs to things like Three Musketeers in this game, King Arthur. I mean, like, just blatant call-outs, not even disguised, just straight up Round Table Hold and Iron Masks and stuff, right? So,
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, like, even I sorry, not to cut you
no,
off,
go ahead,
but
please.
like you had been talking about people's readings of America before, and that's something that has been on my mind since like the game came out. I I get not liking the creator of the evil order of the game. People hate Gwyn and the Lance and Lawrence for good reasons, even though I perceive them as more tragic characters. And they
Agreed.
all hate who? What was that? I'm sorry.
Oh, I said agreed. I think all these characters need to be looked at with a lot more nuance than we give them credit for sometimes.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Like people love to read the Cersei Lannister in America, but I feel like that's so overly destructive. It's so unnuanced. It's oversimplistic. And I love the Daenerys comparison because I think that that really emotionally resonates, this idea of a girl being put into something that she just has to roll with from the very beginning of her life. Um one of my favorite comparisons is Paul Atreides from Dune. And
Mm.
like if we know anything from Armored Core 6, like From Software loves Dune, like there's so many
Right.
Dune references. Yeah, yeah, literally. So like America as Paul Atreides, I think you see, I guess, the greatest way to encapsulate it in one of Dune 1's arc for him, where he goes from thinking of an emperor or a ruler as someone who commands, and he finishes the book by learning that a ruler is someone that serves, like serves the will of the people. Um, like that's a big thing in George Martin's writing as well. So
Oh
you
yeah.
see you see so many lords that are criticized for being people that don't serve their people and instead serve their own whims. Like the Mad King, Aegon, Ares.
Ares.
Yeah, like he's such an encapsulation of that.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
Daenerys. I mean, I love Daenerys as a character. Like, I hate the ending of the TV show because I think they super botched what she's all about. But Daenerys has this line she often repeats that is, "A queen belongs to her people." And Martin is emphasizing, he's exploring ideas about power, and that's why we keep coming, back, same with FromSoft with this idea of this divine power. Like, what does humanity do when they actually have dragons? When they actually have the fire of the gods in their hands? What are you going to do with it? What it all depends on what type of person you are. It just really does. At the end of the day, power doesn't corrupt people. It unmasks them. And so he explores this with Daenerys and her dragons in Slaver's Bay. How do you deal with a slave empire, like, which is obviously so bad and just so corrupt and terrible? Do you kill everybody who's in charge? Do you ignore it and just go back to Westeros and conquer that kingdom? So when I think about America in this context, I really find the Giants' genocide really interesting. Obviously genocide is horrible and not acceptable under any circumstances. But like, what if all these guys are like slavers, right? Like, what if they're all actually really bad? We take that item description of the fell god as evil as like, oh, this is Golden Order propaganda. But again, we're talking about a world where these magical powers do actually exist and they fall into the hands of people, and people do evil things to each other. So, when we look at the Crucible concept in the Forge, I find the Crucible so interesting because the Crucible, is for forging, right? It's for industry, right? You like nature doesn't have a crucible, I mean, as a metaphor, we could say it does, but it doesn't have a real crucible. Humanity has a crucible. We forge stuff. We make things. So when we think about this crucible of life and the idea of, life sprouting for death, and we look at the DLC trailer with Mesmer purging people, you know, Mesmer has all this vampire, he's like a Dracula character. He's Vlad the Impaler, right? So like he's killing all these people and like collecting all their blood, all their life force, And this to me is kind of the crucible concept, and like this blood is what ends up birthing the Erd Tree. Like, all these souls coalesce to create this, like, one. And when we think back to the formless sea, right, the prima materia, and the memory of lost grace and the golden light rising from this big, formless void, which is presumably, just all the energy of creation. Well, we have this idea again of, like, this one essence emerging from the many, a greater will coming from the one great. And Alexander, the warrior jars, these guys are a great example of this, because they are an amalgamation of bodies put into a pot, and it's described as a stew, right? So we have this boiling blood, this boiling bodies idea, this crucible concept, and Alexander is the guy who becomes the consciousness, right? He's the manifestation of all of these souls, all of this unconscious life energy. He's the thing that emerges from it, and so again, the runes as the people, as the tree, when we die, we drop these runes and they sprout. These runes are a collection of our unconscious, and we form that into our consciousness, which is like, assembling the shards of the Elden Ring. I don't know, all this stuff is just so layered, just over and over. It's so cool, honestly.
I completely agree. I really, really adore your use of the great jars as a description of what's going on at the broader level.
They're giant bellies.
Literally, and they continue to consume. Like, Alexander achieves his highest state of being by continuing to grow, and like, you see, like, the Erd tree grows to its fullest potential, and there's minor Erd trees that still have, it works so well.
So, like, Mesmer, right, as this vampire figure, if we think about the Erd tree and its roots eating bodies, right, like, we could start thinking about this tree as, like, a vampire tree. And I'm honestly just ripping off the Weirwood stuff from A Song of Ice and Fire right now, because that's what the Weirwoods are. Is like, people do human sacrifices to these trees, because a tree, is, as I said, it's like this center point where all things, merge back together, which is, a symbol for this prima materia, which leads to transformation. This tree is a vehicle for transformation, and like, that's kind of what Miquella's doing, with Alexander, and his, being a vessel, taking in all these other bodies, all these new consciousnesses, and all these new runes or whatever into himself. Marika, or I mean the the Erd tree, taking in all these bodies, collecting all these runes, coalescing it into this center, which then, is rewritten by the Elden Ring. All this unconscious material is rewritten by the Elden Ring and projected out as the light of the lands between.
It's definitely applicable too. Like, even in the trailer, we see this very specific symbolism of a literal, like, portal tree-looking thing made of flesh, made of corpses, that in the center of, you see this portal to, like, golden, fields that Marika's creating. She's giving consciousness to this, body mass that you describe. I know that people hate the, Miquella X's Griffith type stuff, the Berserk
I don't.
references.
I don't at all. I
Yeah,
think it's super relevant.
I agree. In this specific case, I really do agree, because it's like, there's in some of Griffith's dream sequences during the Golden Age arc of Berserk, he has this recurring dream. Like, the theme of Griffith is, I will have my own kingdom, and his desire to have a kingdom is supported by his band of mercenaries, people that are sworn to die for them, to give their life for him. So one of the tenets of this dream that he has is that he's walking on the corpses of his fellows to get to this perceived castle in the sky, and he has to keep sacrificing these people, these friends. I mean, like, at some point he becomes distanced from them, but he cares for them. We know this from, like, different textual clues we have about Griffith himself. And this is partially why, when he sacrifices his Band of the Hawk to become a god, it's an actual sacrifice. He cares for them. He's sacrificing his emotional bonds. He's sacrificing what makes him human. Not I don't have to over-explain Berserk.
No, you're
But
fine. I mean, again, I think Berserk is. I mean, I don't know why. I literally don't understand why people get so touchy about this. Like Miyazaki is clearly pulling from stuff that he super loves. He loved A Song of Ice and Fire and hired Martin to write it for him. Like he is not just messing around with like Easter eggs and stuff. Like Berserk and A Song of Ice and Fire and Dark Souls and like Full Metal Alchemist. Like these things are all talking about these same esoteric ideas, and it's very clear that FromSoft is just really into them. And Berserk is cool. Like, it's got some problematic stuff in it, but overall, like, it's a really cool series that talks about a lot of the same things that Elden Ring does, and I don't know why we wouldn't want to use it as a reference point. Because, like, that series has Griffith create a giant, world tree that's projecting a fantasy world over the Earth. Like, this is exactly the idea that we're talking about with the Elden Ring. Like, almost quite literally the exact same idea. The Erd Tree, grows from the specific desires and wills of an individual person who's kind of coded as a Jesus figure, and it creates a utopia world that is actually secretly super bad and dark, and there's all these, dark undercurrents, and there's also this, like, what's going on with this, God guy? Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Like, is he doing this for his own selfish reasons? Is he doing this because he really does want to create a utopia for humanity? Like, it's clearly relevant to what's going on in A Song of Ice, or I'm sorry, in a Elden Ring, beyond just, Mikola is Griffith. Like, this is a whole thematic thing. Like, if you want my opinion, I feel like a character like Radigan is actually the one who's kind of more like the Griffith character, and Mikola and Melania as, being born from America and Radigan, to me are just, like, another iteration of this same archetype. And the Erd Tree the Halig Tree creation is just another go at the Erd Tree creation. Like, they're just doing the same thing again.
yeah.
So that's why there's, like, overlapping ideas,
If the cut Heart of Darkness chapter from early Berserk is to like go off of at all, you further see this idea of the people of the world, through their desire for a god, through their desire for control, create the Heart of Darkness, which is the god that is above the god hand. They're the hand of God. Again, you see the greater will and the two fingers symbolism already. These people, the Heart of Darkness creates, causality. It creates fate, which guides the God Hand into existing and exerting its control over the world. So you see the extra layer of the greater will. I also think, though, that you hit the nail on the head about why people don't like Berserk references for the game. It's not out of them being incorrect. I think it's literally just fatigue. Like, you have a lot
right?
of people that will like point and be like, hey, it's Berserk, and like sometimes they're right, but like sometimes they're wrong, and sometimes they like they do the exact same Cersei Lannister thing to America, where they want to simplify something that's really complex, and they want to try and use the fact that they can call out an obvious reference to like be like, that's all it is, and when it's so obviously
it ends up just like diminishing the whole thing ultimately, which is sad because like I said, I do think this is all really, really relevant, just on more like a thematic level. Like, I don't know if Mikkel is actually like an evil guy. I just think there's a lot more complexity there, and I think honestly Miyazaki is aware of this kind of fatigue, and it's kind of why they hired George R. R. Martin to just inject a whole bunch of new life into their style, because they don't have to worry about doing the same thing over again, because they got a whole other person to write it for him this time. So it's just, instead of going like, Mikola is just Griffith, like, we can definitely look at that, but we could also look at Mikola like a Bran character, and there's some interesting things that we can look at with that in like Melania, because Bran does like, some mind control stuff to this character Hodor, which, is interesting in the context of Melania, who's always calling herself the Blade of Mikola, right? It's implying this, like, tool situation. And even if there's not, like, a literal mind control situation going on there is, like, this kind of, like, zealotry, idea associated with Mikola. And if you read other George R. R. Martin stories, he often connects the idea of religious zealotry straight up to mind control. Like, there are just stories where that's just what's going on. So when I look at Mikola, there's just this whole big swirl of different possibilities that make the character so much more interesting to me than just going like, well, they're evil or they're not evil. Some days I do think Mikola could just be straight up Griffith and just be evil and just be manipulating Melania or whatever. But then I think about Bran and how Bran is just a little boy who dreamed about being a knight who fell from a tower and broke his legs, right? Bran goes on his journey up north to meet the three-eyed raven in order to heal his legs in his mind. That's what he thinks is happening. But that's not what's happening. He's, gonna learn magic and open up his third eye, right? He's never gonna walk again. Like, that's never gonna be fixed for him. But he ends up giving up, everything, his whole life to go on this journey, on the hopes of maybe fixing himself and ultimately on the hopes of, maybe helping out his family. So I feel like when we look at that and we consider Mikola and what they're doing in the Shadowlands, I don't know, to me it just resonates a lot more.
Yeah. No, I love the uncertainty that we have over it, and I think that From Software has written enough of, like, this kind of content where I feel like they're definitely just going to write it with that kind of nuance. Like, already people argue to death over what the best ending of the game is, when a lot of them are sort of, like, pretty specifically at least harmful to people. Like,
right?
I don't think that anyone's going to be saying that Dung Eater or the Frenzied Flame leaves no one unharmed. The Age of Fracture obviously doesn't solve anything. The Age of the Duskborn, not everyone wants to be undead, and that just leaves literally two endings, Rani's and Goldmask's. And in both of those cases, you see either reinforcing the establishment or burning it down, which already in real life is a huge debate.
Right.
So not everyone's going to agree about a video game. So getting into the DLC, like, sure, Mikola inspires fanaticism in his followers to the point that they will commit suicide to defend the Halig tree against invaders. But, I mean, is that inspiration of fanaticism a good thing or a bad thing? Is that something he does out of desire to manipulate people, or is it a innate charisma of his being? How does he himself feel about this? Did he grow up and learn to do this and willfully do it? Or is he, like you say, like a Bran type of character where he was literally born into having these powers and, like, might not have even wanted to cultivate them in the first place and was on a completely different mind track until he eventually just snapped into the realization that he wasn't. Like, going back to the Dune references, I think that Marika and Mikola echo a lot of who they are. They even both have blades of themselves. Like, Malekith is the blade of Marika, Melania is the blade of Mikola. There's clear parallels to be drawn here, and in those parallels is the Paul Atreides, the Leto the Second parallel. Like, Marika failed in a way well, Paul Atreides failed in a way that his son had to fix. Marika obviously failed, and Mikola is, I mean, he's doing something,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, there's just a lot of interesting, like, I guess archetypal overlap between Mikola and Marika, and, like, what, and savior figures, like, we in Western culture, like, we obviously have this whole Jesus archetype, Superman, Jesus, superheroes. Like, this stuff is just, like, inundated into our culture right now. But, like, do we really want to just depend on one person to save us all? Like, for their one perspective to be the one that we solved all the problems with? Like, I feel like these games are making a very large criticism against, monarchical thinking here. Like, almost against, like, fascist thought of, like, the strong man who, I mean, God...
The Ubermensch. Yeah, it's a rejection of it.
Yeah, I think, these games are really... really pushing that idea, and they're doing it in just such a cool way because, like, we are becoming the Ubermensch in these games. Like, in all of them, we are the ones who are coming to these lands and just dominating them and then reshaping them into our will, Elden Ring makes it so much more explicit than the Dark Souls games, but Dark Souls 2 has the same idea of, like, these cycles of kingdoms, like this dude who rises up, overthrows the old order, kills everybody or whatever, and starts his kingdom, and then, that falls, and so, I almost, push back against this idea of, like, looking at these games through like this lens of good and evil specifically, and just thinking about it more on like this human level of like what do people do with this type of power? What do you do in this type of world? How do you actualize yourself under these crazy circumstances?
Yeah, I think self-actualization is a really big theme of the games in a way. Like, obviously, in a video game, you're on a set path. There's only a set amount of things you can do. But in the thematic undertones of the game is this try and fail until you succeed, until you achieve, you know? And you see that the most in Elden Ring. I mean, I mentioned at the beginning that the Elden Ring itself is akin to the Holy Grail in some ways, like the Cup of God. And in that sense, the Holy Grail is a quest for self-meaning and self-actualization. Like, that's what in Arthurian legend it really represented. I think a possible influence on the game in Miyazaki and From Software's work could be Stephen King's The Dark Tower series, in which you have the Dark Tower, which represents the Axis Mundi, and the Holy Grail at the same time, and you have Roland and a King Arthur inversion archetype where his kingdom has fallen and he's the only one left, and he must seek the Holy Grail, the Dark Tower, to find meaning, to self-actualize himself. And yeah, it's fascinating
No,
stuff.
this theme is like, I mean, this fallen world theme where we have to pick up the pieces and find the meaning, I think has always been present in these games, but I think it is, in some ways, like the core theme of Elden Ring. Like it's almost like Miyazaki is having a meta conversation with us all about how we form theories and decide the stories of these games, and he's specifically designed this one to kind of like push back against any real authorial like certainty that we could pull out of this thing as a community. Like, I mean, I don't know if I believe anybody's theories totally about anything that happens in this game, like,
I don't
and
even believe my own.
yeah, right, exactly. Like any given Sunday, I could be flip flopping on any of this stuff. For me, I don't even care. Like, I'm just having fun, doing stuff like this and talking to other people about it. I was listening to I believe his name is Robert Anton Wilson, talking about Finnegan's Wake, and he said the best way to approach it is to have like discussion groups, because it's not about finding objective truth and pulling out the real true story of what's going on. It's about finding these little kernels of humanity and beauty in the art, which like will just help inform us and help us grow, like we were talking about at the beginning about this game, almost being like just like a nexus point of people, of human history. This game is covering from the beginning of the origins of God or consciousness or whatever, all the way to like the literal end of existence, like a full cycle of reality existing and then dying. And they all do this, which is just such a cool meta theme to tie into the idea of a kingdom rising and falling, and people growing and dying, but then this undead idea where like we won't let people die, we won't let the kingdom end, we won't let the story finish or conclude so that the new cycle can start.
I completely agree. Honestly, I don't think I could have said it better myself. Yeah, I agree.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm just spitballing, so.
No, I'm here for it. Yeah, I love this. I really hope to make another episode with you. We're getting
I would love to do a bunch of these. To be totally honest, like I'm just shaking off the cobwebs here. Like there's so many interesting angles we could go at this series. So, I mean, we could do a whole thing on America and her this savior archetype, this messiah figure idea in different points of literature. Because I really do think this is what Miyazaki wants us to do. I don't think he wants us to have a closed reading of this game. I think he is using all of these illusions to get us to look outside the game, to like to really expand our knowledge, to not just have the artificial experience of it in the game and we claim in the Elden Ring and we become God or whatever. It's like, no, we are all on a path to enlightenment when we like dig into this game. That's why I find Tarnished Archaeologists and Quelaag and Saint Trina and just everybody's content so interesting, because you have to get personal in this game. You have to make it your own interpretation. Otherwise, we're just kind of reading the wiki.
Exactly. You have to find what resonates with you and what you want to build off of in your own emotional ways that you want to explain further. Like like the prehistory very explicitly is written to defy interpretation. Like you say, there's no closed reading of this. There's if all you're looking for is an explanation, like a textual explanation of something, then you're not gonna find it with Elden Ring because it wants you to look deeper. It wants you to form your own conclusions. You're not, they might, like people always say, there might be a core part of the story that was intended that is held in, the minds of Miyazaki and George Martin and all those people that worked on the game. But like, the death of the author is it's intended,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So, like, with Martin, so this is what I do find so interesting about this, like, struggle and, like, the meta-narrative around this game, Because on some level, they did hire George R. R. Martin to write them a story for this game. And he did do that. Like, he did give them some sort of mythos. And I love that Miyazaki describes it as part mythos, part history, part epic poem. Because, like, that's basically how George R. R. Martin is writing all of his stuff. And so when people are, like, searching for this narrative, I kind of find it amusing because, all of George R. R. Martin's writing, especially, post A Song of Ice and Fire, is all very POV oriented, right? It's all very in world. There is no omniscient information about A Song of Ice and Fire out there, really. Like the world book, the World of Ice and Fire, is written by maesters in world based on historical documents and primary sources. The book Fire and Blood is, again, it's a book about the Targaryen dynasty, about their history, written from other maesters' perspectives and just accounts and letters and all this. And in those books, the maesters are talking about sources. They're talking about how they don't have all the information, how some of these instances we'll just never know the answers of, because what Martin is really trying to do, and what I think Elden Ring is really trying to do, is like speak to how history and and information in general, like it's all narrativized in a way, like we're all creating a story every day, for our lives, for our individual, jobs, for our career, we're all constructing some sort of like narrative to be able to relate to the world that we're in. And when we look at history, I think the thing that Martin is like super interested, and I think the thing that, Elden Ring is super concerned about, is the narrative of history and who gets to create that narrative.
Yeah, the winners write the history,
Oh
famous
yeah,
quote.
absolutely. But like when we think about, the Elden Ring being able to write reality, it's becomes this really cool like literalization of that metaphor, like we play through this whole game and we're told all about Godfrey as this King Arthur type figure, and at the end of the game we find out it's not even his, that's not, Godfrey's not even his name, like his story
Mhm.
is largely, propaganda, and we realize that a lot of that story is told on those like sword monuments, which themselves are constructed in world by the Golden Order to tell the story of, you know, Godfrey's conquest and stuff. So like when we connect that to the idea of King Arthur and how that is a mythos in itself, and we have this whole round table hold idea, like I really keep coming back to this idea of, writing reality with this ring, like, you know, writing people's fate, getting to control the story, like, when we think about the Martin angle, like, this is the author, the author god concept. The Elden Ring and is a language system, right? It's made out of runes, and there's a giant hand for the greater will who is authoring, the story of the game. I don't know. It's super meta, but like I legitimately think this is what's going on.
I think no, I mean I think there's a legitimate argument for that reading. I think that From Software does get a little bit meta with it, and even just looking at the inspirations of the game, especially like the Norse inspirations. If you look at Futhark runes from Norse mythology, you have this idea of the runic inscriptions being magical, and I mean like in the modern day that magic is attributed to the runes themselves. It's like this idea that, oh, these runes have special powers to them because of what they represent. But if you look back at like the original use of the runes, it didn't matter what language they were written in. It was just that words were magic. You know, like even today, like there's Neil Gaiman, I think, has gone on record as, you know, he's on and talked about how words are magic, and like I think a lot of authors feel that way. A lot of people should feel that way because the words have power over your mind. They have the power to move and change you, like in real life. You know, like we're all talking about Elden Ring because we played a game where words impacted us. You know, like it's
Yeah, so
it's meta.
this game has led me down so many rabbit holes, and the one I like the most is learning about semiotics, which is the study of signs and symbols and their meaning. It's a field of linguistics, right? And a sign, so like we're talking like runes, right? These runes are a sign; they're a symbol that is standing in for a concept, right? And this concept is always going to be nebulous, right? It's kind of like the Platonic ideal, concept, the idea of forms, like there's
Yeah,
always
like
going to be.
for the viewers, I guess just to slow down,
Oh,
but
sorry,
like
go
the
ahead.
Platonic ideal of forms in, you know, ancient Greek philosophy from Plato, where there's an idea that, you know, like if you've ever heard of like the man in the cave metaphor, that's a similar idea. Like we live in a material world where all we see is imperfect shapes, which are representations of the forms which exist at a higher plane, and like, you know, like we have all these cups in the real world, but there's an ideal cup that has all of the properties of real world cups and encapsulates all of them at once.
Yeah, so
Just to explain for the
no,
viewers.
you're all good. Yeah, so it's a concept, right? So like this cup is ultimately a concept. Like it doesn't exist until we make it exist by, giving it a form, right? And so, when we typically think about this, we're using language to give things forms because we're like describing things, or we give something a name, right? And that is, it defines it in our mind in a way. And like, my favorite quote for Miyazaki for how he describes the Elden Ring is he says, "Elden Ring is the name given to a mysterious concept that defines the world itself." Right? So this Elden Ring is, the ultimate word. It's the language system that is describing the entire world. And like, there's this theory called linguistic relativity, where it's like what you said. It's where language determines your cognition and your thought process, and it's really interesting to look into. There's some TED talks people could look up if they wanted, but the concept I think is pretty foundational to like Elden Ring and kind of like a lot of just art in general, because like we all have these ideas in our unconscious mind that we are trying to express. I mean, even right now I'm just rambling trying to put all these crazy concepts into some sort of form that can then be communicated to other people, but there's no way for me to pull out what's actually in my mind and put it out into everybody else's mind. We're just using our words, right? We're just using an approximation, right? And so this goes back to this veil idea, right? These words veil everything. They veil these forms in its meaning. America is associated with a veil item, and this veil item lets us change forms, right? Because the veil is it's the symbol that we put over the concept to give it its form. There's this idea called the doctrine of signatures, which is about this, connecting it to the word of God. The idea being that everything in nature has like a signature on it from God, right? Like a rune, like a name. Excuse me. Which gives it its form and shape. And some people take this idea, far, and excuse me again. They take this idea to mean like, if a plant is shaped like a heart, like maybe that herb would be able to aid in some sort of, health, heart, cardiac something, right? And we see the arterial leaf item in the game that is literally like a plant shaped like a little heart, because this idea is just infused into the entire game because runes are infused into basically everything, because the Elden Ring's light, is made of runes. It's made of language, and this language, shines down and gives the world its form.
Yeah, yeah.
I
It's
know these
fascinating
ideas are
stuff.
so crazy.
No, I mean I get it though. I mean, I really like like you say, I mean, you use words to describe a feeling. I think one of my favorite things about art, especially like literature, is just that it's the art of saying something without saying that thing. You say something else and you direct people's thoughts. And I mean, us analyzing something is trying to put the thing into more direct words. But even then, we're dressing up our own emotional takeaways. What
Yeah.
we care about, and we're using our descriptions of it to describe, try and translate our emotions to you, you know, like that's the point of language, communication. It's an
Yeah.
art.
And ultimately, we all think in a language, right? Like when we take in information, the way that we're perceiving it in our brains is through like language. It's
It's inherently
inescapable.
biased.
Yes. And so to me, like that's this really interesting idea. Like so, Death of the Author is an essay written by a semiotician named Roland Barthes, right? He's this French guy, and like I really love his writing, and he has this book called Mythologies, where he is just taking a semiotic analysis on various cultural things in France, and like I think he wrote it in the 50s, but his whole point with his book Mythologies is that, signs and symbols, they have this initial meaning, this denotative meaning, right? Like when the word tree, means a tree, right? Like it to most people, depending on the language, right, that we're using. But there's like often a second level of signification, right? So the word tree points to tree, but like as a culture, we can then use the symbol of the tree to mean other things, right? Like we've already been talking about, like the tree is consciousness, right? So this tree doesn't just symbolize one thing, it can symbolize lots of things. And people can use these symbols in different ways. And mythology is, in my opinion, like and kind of this guy's opinion as well, is like the conscious use of symbols to construct a narrative, right? Like when we look at like Greek mythology, nowadays we think of them as like, fantasy stories, for all intents and purposes. But like these things were like infused into people's daily lives as their way of understanding the world, And so if, Zeus is depicted as, the god king of everybody, that like kind of sets a patriarchal tone for the rest of culture, and this is, this idea about mythology goes into all media. Whenever we're constructing a piece of art, we're using signs and symbols to express the artistic idea that we have in our head, and we just you can't get away from this idea of language. Like it's in a way that's why the Elden Ring is a rune, because it imprisons us in a way. Like we can't step outside of it. There's no way to describe something beyond it. And I'm not talking about just words, but signs, like pictures. Like we are interpreting the world through language, and language can be manipulated. It's ultimately arbitrary. A word only means what it means because a culture has decided that that word means that. Like we all kind of just tacitly agree that whatever we say a thing means, it means. But that can change, and when people are in power and they can control the narrative, they use art and symbols to do that in a way that's less direct, I guess. And so that's why I find the game's like symbolism so interesting, because when we read the item descriptions, like and we hear the dialogue that characters are giving us, like a lot of it is true, but like there's a lot more context that's going around behind it that isn't being said. And we know this is true for like all language. Whenever we say anything, there's always subtext going on. There's always internal subjective things that like I'm trying to communicate to you, or that you're trying to communicate to me, that aren't being said. Sometimes it could be through body language, again, like through your clothing. It's just all sorts of this stuff. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, a
I
huge
think
part
this.
of literature is like cultural illusion, this shared understanding of symbolism, and
Hmm.
linguistics goes so wholly into that, because your entire like cultural view, your entire worldview is informed by your understanding of your culture, and your entire understanding of your culture is informed by your linguistic ability. Like I think that's partially why like bilingual people. Like, I think that like bilingualism is so cool because it gives you an avenue of understanding the world from a different lens. I think one thing that I do has been on my mind to try and bring up before the end is that we've used like, we've used terms like archetypes a lot, and I feel like, part of that has that like Jungian connotation, this idea of like taking a lot of like historical symbolism and reducing it in a way to archetypes. And we've already talked about like how we dislike this idea of reducing the simplicity and nuance of something to fit into an archetype of a mold. And I guess like I think that's what most people's like core problem, at least like the one of the bigger ones that's talked about with Carl Jung is just that like I don't know. I mean,
No,
I don't
I'm
think that
totally
I have
with
the
you.
yeah.
I got you. Uh, okay, so when when we look at semiotics, it starts with this guy named Saussure, right? And he ultimately leads this to this idea of structuralism, right? This idea like what you're talking about, like that there are all these archetypes and these interconnected things, and like there's a big system, and if we can just analyze the structure, we can understand the whole system, right? And people use structuralism as a form of analysis, right? And one of the most famous ones that everybody should know is Joseph Campbell and the Hero of a Thousand Faces. Like, that is a structuralist analysis of myth. He is looking at all these different cultures and kind of putting them together in this big tapestry, right? Creating a unified meaning of all of these different cultures, belief systems, and myths based on his perspective, right? Based on his cultural upbringing and his viewpoints. And that's not to say that there's not good insights and awesome things in both Jung and Joseph Campbell, but like we have to recognize that these guys are just one perspective on a thing. And so when we look at Elden Ring and how it uses language, right? Like how can I say this? Like, language is built on the idea of opposites, right? When we think of the one great as this big giant thing that's just undefined, in order to start defining it, we have to create a split, like a separation, right? The one great and the greater will. Two sides of the coin. Otherwise, we can't understand it. Like meaning comes from contrast. It comes from comparing things and understanding the similarities and the differences. But if everything is just one thing, that's impossible to do. So with language, we start, by breaking it out into like, an us versus them. And this is, goes into the consciousness and the unconscious, the masculine and the feminine. In symbolic terms, this split affects the entirety of nature. And in Hermetic thinking, the theory of gender isn't about, sexuality specifically. It's about, these two spiritual energies that make up you. And we all have these, and they're all in flux. And we can use, and, when you look at a rock that's been in a river for a long time, it's like smooth, right? And you might describe that as like soft or, or smooth or feminine, right? But we're not talking about it in like a literal manner. We're talking about, like these kind of the way we categorize things in our brain. And so this creates this duality throughout all of nature, which is ultimately like what we're kind of like trying to unite through language, right? We're trying to put these two disparate halves together in a way to create an understanding or a meaning. But when you only have one perspective doing that, when you have somebody like Joseph Campbell putting everything into his package of meaning, which is a very like kind of Western and Christian view, like that's kind of, transforms all of that mythology, into being interpreted through that language. And so the Elden Ring, creates this interpretation of all of reality. It creates this structure through language, through these dualities, through these differences that, create more and more categories, like a big chain, or like the tree of life, emanations, right? Like it creates this big new whole out of all these, disparate parts. And then that shatters, right? Like in this game, that shatters. Like the whole point of the game is that the Elden Ring, the meaning and the narrative of the world has broken. It doesn't exist anymore. Elden Ring is the name given to the mysterious concept that defines the world itself, and it's broken. So when we look at like Joseph Campbell and Jung and their archetypal ideas and all this stuff, like yeah, there's value there, but we're meant to smash that stuff apart. Like we're meant to pull it apart and find the unfortunate connotations that they maybe put in there. Like I read a lot of these like old timey books, and there's a lot of unfortunate and very just racist and sexist language just all over this stuff, all over esoteric literature. It's just full of these ideas because, back then people were not, thinking in this more holistic viewpoint. They were thinking from their viewpoint alone. But the truth is that, the one great was unified in a way. It's just not unified under one specific person's vision. It's an accepting of all visions of the whole. It's like a holistic view of things.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that made sense, but
No, I'm with you on it. I mean, like, existence defines itself through contrast, and we unify it through language. Ooh, like, yeah, I mean, like, it's like, what's the metaphor? Like, if you take 5 blind men and you have them all feel a different part of an elephant, and they all tell you what they felt, they're gonna describe very different animals, but they all felt the same elephant. Like,
yeah, that's
people
a great
can
way to
take
put it.
different. Yeah, you can take different perceptions of the world and still come away with different. Like, there can be There can be 2 truths that oppose each other that are simultaneously true. It's layered.
Absolutely.
This has been like a wonderful conversation. I truly wish to do another episode. I'm not sure if I can define the topic for viewers, what that might be, especially with all of the upcoming DLC. But like, yes, we should absolutely talk about something again, whether that's Marika the Martyr or a different topic.
Hey,
Yeah.
no worries, and I just want to say that this is my first time doing anything like this, and this whole time, like I'm losing my train of thought because of nervousness, right? The more I do this, the better these things will start to come across. The more organized I'll be. Like next time, I'll have like maybe some quotes that I can use. I really wanted this one to just kind of be like just getting over the hump. I know that maybe like might be unfortunate for your podcast specifically, but like I don't know, I just really like talking about this stuff, and I would love to do this again in the future.
I would too. And I think this has been a great episode, so
I mean, I hope so. Like, honestly, on my end, I'm just like, oh my god, I'm fucking rambling. I'm just all over the place. Because this game, it's like, I loved what you and Rage talked about, where, like, oh, you gotta be careful when you're pulling on this tapestry or whatever. And I'm just, like, shooting this. I'm just ripping this thing apart, Like, I'm just all over the place. But, all these topics are just like so abstract and metaphorical, and like yeah, we could talk about a lot of the specific little stuff in the game, like Dialos's quest line, and or Debbie Human Queens or whatever. But to me, like all that stuff ultimately feeds into this larger like narrative and ideas in the story, because a lot of it is just so hard to contextualize without these bigger ideas in place. Like a lot of it can feel meaningless in some ways without these bigger ideas in place. So I don't know. I'd love to do episodes on like talking about the astral, Erd tree, interior world. This idea of like the crucible and like the nature, kind of one great idea. I don't know. I feel like this episode was very fun, but I don't know if I delivered my stuff as good as I can deliver it. You know what I'm saying?
It's introductory. I think that really alchemical symbolism, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, all of the isms, it's such a vast sea of knowledge that you can only really dip your toe into it for a first experience, but from that first experience comes contextualization. So from this point, we have so many places to leap off into. Like the micro represents the macro. If we want to go very, there's so many places to go.
Yeah, no, I mean Dialos. I was writing something the other day about Dialos and his quest line and how it I find it so interesting because he's the only character in the game that ends up getting a Newman rune under a specific set of circumstances. And I feel like that's like something that's really overlooked by everybody, because
does he
like,
not have the Newman rune before? Or...
No, from how I understand that quest line playing out, you only get the Newman rune if he dies in Jarburg, defending all the jars.
Interesting. Okay, so I always took the simple route. Okay, I know that we're extending the episode, but just this one last thing. But I always took the simple route of assuming that he was just a Newman bloodline, that like he was Newman. But like, are you implying that he becomes Newman by defending the jars? That it's
Yeah.
some sort of like
So
purification thing?
yeah, kind of. So, earlier I talked about Ymir and the idea of like self-sacrifice, and like, America is crucified and she's a Newman, right? So, she has this Jesus imagery of self-sacrifice with her. And then Dialos's whole story is about, kind of like forging his own path and finding his own way, which takes him to a self-sacrificial act that then goes on to inspire Jar Boy, Jar Baron or whatever, to be like Dialos, right? He's going to go out and protect people now. And George R. R. Martin, this to me is like almost his whole quest line is almost like a direct call out to Brienne of Tarth, right? Who kind of epitomizes George R. R. Martin's heroic archetype. Because for George R. R. Martin, like a hero is someone who fights the good fight, who tries. You don't have to win, you don't have to succeed, but it's in the effort that is heroic, right? And Dialos's quest is so beautiful to me because this guy, he dies for these jars, and it's an echo of, Brienne fighting for these kids at this inn at, I want to say it's in a Feast for Crows, but, they're going to be attacked by these, raiders or whatever, and, she knows she can't, win against these guys, but she goes out there and she fights anyways, right? And this self-sacrificial act, I feel is like the main point of George R. R. Martin's like heroic archetype. Like that's what a hero is to him. A queen's duty is to her people. It's somebody who does this action for the benefits of others. So when I look at Dialos getting this Newman rune, and I look at Marika and how she's, the Elden Ring, and we've been talking about, the Erd Tree is the center, and we didn't touch on this, but like grace and fate, right? This kind of guiding light. She's like this guiding principle for everybody. And Dialos, when he dies, he becomes this guiding light or this guiding principle for Jar Baron. And my whole thing with the Elden Ring, beyond the language idea, is that it represents the pole star, the North Star, right? And so Marika becomes the North Star for the entire world through her self-sacrifice, kind of like Christ, like whether or not we like the Bible or not, Christ seems like a pretty okay dude. He's trying to help everybody out, right? He becomes this like example, this guiding light of like what our best selves can be. Now, there's maybe a fun twist going on with Marika and all that idea, but when we look at the Newman and this idea of the North Star, the guiding star, I'm reminded of Greek mythology and how heroes are put up into the constellations, right? They become part of the heavens. And this heavens idea, the as above, the so below, right? This heaven, kind of represents the archetypal realm, right? It's where the light is that is shining down. Like if we think about the memory of lost grace as, rising up and, shining down on that dark water, that's, like the heavens shining down on earth. And that, Earth is like a reflection of it, going back to that, Carrier Mir idea. And so the Carians, follow the zodiac. They're looking at the stars to read fate. And so, they're looking at almost like the story of the heavens, the narrative of the heavens. And Dialos, through his actions, becomes a part of that narrative. But he's not like a Newman rune, or not like a mending rune, put into the Elden Ring. Like he represents like, a new star in the sky, like a new story that somebody could tell. And this gets all into like the idea of the spirit turners and music and the painting idea that we see in the game. Back into the storytelling idea. Like the dreamscape idea. I don't know. There's a lot to it, but I really think that Dialos's quest is really important for understanding like what is going on with Marika, because otherwise like we don't get a lot of info about Newmans at all.
No, not really. I do really like your theory though. I think I have to consider that in a new light because the idea that like like already we have the idea that runes change to represent their owner. So Dialos achieving the state of Newman, that's quite the it just opens up a lot new ideas of understanding Newman. Part of what I started thinking about is the process of the magnum opus and the creation of the Philosopher's Stone. Because if you look at Dialos, he goes through all of the steps. He begins with Negredo, confession, or separation, where he is broken down to his bare essentials. He comes to the lands between, thinking of himself as like a warrior, and he learns he's not. He's broken down into nothing. And there he experiences albedo, or illumination, or initiation, where he becomes, he realizes purpose, and he goes to Jarberg. And there he undergoes education, or, Citrinitas, or the return, he learns of how to care for the jars, he learns of his purpose, and finally he ends with Rubedo, or transformation, where he earns his Newman rune, like in your theory, and he defends Jarbaran from the raiders, and in doing so he dies, but he transforms. He not only evolves into Newman, but he becomes the flesh that will fuel the Jarbaran in beginning its quest. And if we take that to the macro level, we have this idea of the Jarbaran as the Philosopher's Stone now. The Philosopher's Stone is the creation of the Philosopher's Tree, and you take that, you yourself referenced Alexander as representing the Crucible at a micro level, Anyway, that's where my thoughts go.
No, absolutely, and I love that idea because, I can connect it with something that Jarbaran says in that village. He talks about rare flowers being in that village. It's one of the places where these rare flowers blooms, right? And so this rare flower idea, we could compare it to, the golden flower, right? The completion of the opus, right? And Newmen are described as, I think it's long-lived and seldom born. So like, to me, like, these Newmen, they come from another world, right? That's the weird thing about them. So we think spirit world, but to me, like, the spirit world and the cosmos, the stars, same idea. Stars are described as residual life, spirits are spirits, residual life. So I think there's like a lot of overlapping there. And so Dialos, through his sacrifice in Jarberg, essentially blooms. He completes the opus, and it's not just, him transforming into the rune or Jarbaran, right? But Jarbaran's going to go out into the world and hopefully spread his way of doing things, his way of being a warrior. Alexander's talking to us, maybe Jarbaran's going to go out there and, talk to other people. And then that, story of Dialos and what he did is going to change other people's viewpoints. And like, this gets into the very idea of what we're talking about with Elden Ring, changing, our perceptions of reality, or how fiction can, be the thing that, gives us meaning in our lives, or helps us contextualize things, or how we should approach things, or whatever, and so, the alchemical opus is often compared to a work of art, right? And so that's like, we're all going through the alchemical process when we play this game, as we seek this enlightenment, as it all, transforms all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been, once again, a wonderful conversation. If you would like to, would like to, for viewers' sake, if you'd like, words, oh my
right,
God.
Where to find me?
Yes, where will viewers find you? What kind of theories would you like to direct them to?
I'm primarily on the Lore Talk subreddit, for better or worse. I got a Twitter, Quirkus23, anybody can hit me up at. A Discord, Quirkus on Discord. Like, legitimately, I'm down to talk to anybody about these ideas, and I'll probably do better in typing. Haha.
You were wonderful over speech as well, though.
Well, thank you. I had such a good time doing this. I'm, looking forward to hopefully doing more in the future. Just such a wonderful time. I appreciate you so much for how supportive you've been, how friendly you've been. Like, you had no reason to be that way, and you are, and I just think that's so nice. So thank you for having me.
I appreciate it. Thank you for coming, and thank you to the viewers for watching. I make this to distribute it among people, and as a platform to talk with like-minded peers. It's purely really a hobby that I enjoy. So if you'd like to partake, leave a comment or share it with a friend, or just tell me what you think. And yeah, thank you as always for joining, and don't you dare go hollow on me.